So our next discussion will be loans and receivables. For this session, we will be finishing all the theoretical concepts relating to your loans and receivables. And to present the topics referred to this particular slide. So the contents of our discussion today will be introduction, to be followed by your trade and other receivables, so all concepts relating to that, followed by notes receivable, and then we have loans receivable, and then finally we have receivable financing. So these are the contents of our discussion. So to start with, let us first have the introduction. So for the introduction, let us first define yung ating loans and receivables. So by definition, loans and receivables are non-derivative financial assets with fixed or determinable payments that are not quoted in an active market. Okay. So, first muna, no? Although i-dissect din naman natin siya dun sa ating characteristic later on. So, first of all, in the definition, we need to remember that loans and receivables are non-derivative financial assets. Okay? So, meaning they cannot be used for hedging purposes. So, they are simple or they are basic financial assets. Okay? And with fixed or determinable payments. Okay? So, pwedeng fixed. Okay? Pwedeng determinable. And actually, based on the characteristic, pwede rin kasi na hindi mo ma-determine yung kung kailan yung payment na, although you will still receive the payment. Okay? And one of the most important item in your definition is they are not quoted in an active market. Okay? So, hindi siya quoted sa active market. Kasi kapag quoted na yung financial asset na yan, it will now become considered as investments. Okay? So, pag sinabi lang naman na not quoted, ibig sabihin hindi yan traded. Okay? Or hindi yan instrument that is subject to trading in the active market. Okay? So, that's for the definition. So these are our characteristics. Okay, so first yun, they may or may not have a fixed or determinable payment. Just like what I said, there are certain receivable contracts, okay, wherein there, okay, nakalagay yung interval ng payment, magkano yung amount, etc. There is also, or there are also receivables wherein there are no fixed payments pero determinable yung payment kasi alam mo kung magkano yung tatanggapin at saka based on the terms of the contract. Like example for receivables, hindi mo alam kung kailan talaga magbabayad but you can determine kung kailan yung time period kung kailan siya magbabayad. Okay? However, nakalagay kasi may or may not. Okay? This is in situations wherein there is already an overdue receivable. 'Di ba? Parang yung concept niya, receivable pa rin naman siya. Yun nga lang overdue na. So kapag overdue na siya, hindi na satisfy yung mga fixed or determinable payments, but still you recognize it as a receivable because you are still expecting to recover an amount from that particular instrument or that particular item. So may not, pwede rin. Pwede rin nawala na yung fixed or determinable payment na but still you are recognizing it as a receivable because you are still expecting to receive, okay, an amount from that particular receivable. Okay? Specify na natin kanina, they are not quoted in the active market. Okay, so they cannot be traded or they cannot become a subject in an active market or an item to be traded or to be sold or bought in an active market. Next, the holder can recover substantially all of its investment unless there has been a credit deterioration. So basically, ang concept kasi niyan, kung may receivable ka, ang expectation mo, kukolektahin mo lang yung receivable. So you are expecting that you will recover all of the amount na nandun. Okay? Except nga kapag may credit deterioration wherein you are now going to recognize an amount of impairment or an amount to be deducted from the total amount because either hindi na makabayad talaga yung ating debtor, okay, or other situations resulting to credit deterioration. And the holder does not have a demonstrated positive intention and ability to hold them to maturity. Um, the concept here is this definition is trying to distinguish a normal loan and receivable from an amortized cost instrument na financial asset. 'Di ba? Kasi kapag amortized cost na financial asset, ganito yung definition niya. 'Di ba? Parang basically the instrument is being held for principally for the collection of cash flows which are payments for principal and interest. So ibig sabihin, kapag amortized cost ka, ang purpose mo is to hold it until maturity. Ang term na ginagamit before in PAS 39 is held to maturity security. So this is simply to distinguish a loan and receivable from a held to maturity instrument. Okay? So yun lang naman yan. Next, we go to the various concepts of your receivables. So first, yun, financial assets that represent a contractual right to receive cash or other financial assets from another entity. So kaya nga siya financial asset. Diba? Kapag financial asset, ang matatanggap mo is either cash or other financial assets din. So kumbaga, exchange of other financial assets. Yan. Next tayo, can be classified as trade or non-trade receivables. So ano ibig sabihin kapag trade? Ano ibig sabihin pag non-trade? Nandito yan sa baba. Kapag trade receivable, ito yung mga receivables natin that are directly related to the ordinary course of business, okay, ng ating entity. Okay, yan o. Trade receivables are claims arising from the sale of goods and services in the ordinary course of business. In other words, yan talaga yung nature ng negosyo mo. Okay? Usually or usual types are accounts receivable and notes receivable. Pero yung notes receivable dapat natanggap mo sa customer. Okay? In relation to sa utang niya doon sa company. These receivables that are expected to be realized within the normal operating cycle or 1 year, whichever is longer, is treated as current assets. So, nabigay na rin dito yung decision guide natin for the classification of the asset as whether it is going to be current or non-current. Okay, so for trade receivables, it's still going to be current for as long as it is collectible within the normal operating cycle. Kahit kunyari, lumampas yan ng 1 year kung mas mahaba yung normal operating cycle. Pero kung ang normal operating cycle ay mas mababa sa 1 year or lower than 1 year, then the reckoning point is 1 year. Kasi nga, whichever is longer. However, for non-trade receivables, meaning ang non-trade receivables, lahat na yan nang naiwan. Okay? Naiwan na receivables other than those that are from the ordinary course of business. So, ibig sabihin yun yung mga naiwan. Ang reckoning point natin or ang decision guide natin dyan para malaman kung current or non-current siya, yung 1 year period lang. Because the operating cycle is irrelevant in this case kasi hindi nga siya trade receivable. Okay, non-trade yan. So, ang mga examples ng non-trade receivables natin, yan na yung mga receivables natin sa associates, advances to your employees, okay? And other types of receivables na hindi natin na-acquire in relation to our trade or business or trade or operations natin. Okay, so yan yung concepts natin ng receivables. So with that, since na-discuss na rin natin ang trade and non-trade receivables, then we are now going to specifically discuss all the concepts relating to these types of receivables na. Yan. So na-discuss na natin kanina, pag trade, dapat galing sa ordinary course of business. Kapag non-trade, yan na yung mga others. Okay? Other sources na yan. Okay? So ganun lang naman ang decision natin. So for our financial statement presentation, yung trade receivables, general rule, always current. Okay, so kapag silent yung problem as to the period of collectibility of your accounts receivable or trade notes receivable, automatic lahat yan ay current na. Okay? Kasi nga, kapag silent yung problem, ang assumption is it is still collectible within the normal operating cycle. So just like Let's say for example, you're talking about a real estate business, okay? Na meron siyang mga receivables sa mga customers niya na bumibili ng real estate or um pwedeng dito, nagre-rent nung property under long-term receivable contract, no? So basically, ang mangyayari diyan is for as long as the payment period is within the normal terms of its operations, kahit lumampas pa yan ng 1 year, considered pa rin siya na current kasi nga related siya dun sa ordinary course of business natin. Okay? So, another case there is, let's say for example, nagbenta sila ng bahay tapos yung normal terms ng pagbabayad ng bahay is kailangan bayaran within 3 years, kunyari. So, yun yung normal term. So, ibig sabihin, yung normal operating cycle ng real estate business na yun is to collect the receivables within the normal term of 3 years. So that is the operating cycle. If that is the operating cycle, kahit na 3 years yun, since it is longer, then the receivables are still considered to be current. Yan. For non-trade receivables, yun, 1 year lang talaga. So, any receivable or any non-trade receivable that is collectible within 1 year will be treated as current, while non-trade receivables that are collectible beyond 1 year, they will now become non-current or long-term na sila. Okay. Yan. So, trade and non-trade receivables that are current assets are aggregated and presented in the statement of financial position as trade and other receivables. So, kumbaga parang after kung ang ginagawa natin is decreasing liquidity, okay? So therefore parang may current non-current classification. After mong ilagay yung cash and cash equivalents, second line item mo will be trade and other receivables. Tapos kung gusto mong ibigay yung or ilagay yung mga details ng mga trade and other receivables mo, then you are going to present that in a separate note dun sa ating notes to financial statements. Okay, so we now go to initial measurement. So again, just like what I said, there will now be differences in the measurement of your receivables, okay, based on the provisions of PFRS or IFRS 15, okay? However, yun nga, we need to consider kasi since test bank ang pinag-uusapan natin sa LECPA or sa CPA board examination, you need to determine or you need to assess whether the question is an old question or a question related to PFRS 15. So of course, most of the time naman kapag nagre-refer yung measurement sa isang standard, sasabihin naman kung based ba siya sa specific standard. So in the absence of any kumbaga information na PFRS 15 yung basis, then you are going to use the traditional measurement of your receivables or traditional presentation of your receivables based on what you initially learned before. Yung pag sinabi natin traditional, yung normal lang na i-measure mo lang siya at the stated na amount na nandun sa receivables. Wala kang adjustments for any any contract, liability, etc. Okay? Kasi nasa provision ng PFRS 15 na yan. So with that, let us discuss this isa-isa. So first bullet point tayo, trade receivables that do not have a significant financing component are measured at the transaction price in accordance with PFRS 15 revenue from contracts with customers. So in other words, the usual pa rin. Okay, kung magkano yung contract price, pumiyok na. Kung magkano yung contract price na nandun sa ating mismong transaction or dun sa agreement, yun na yun, without any other considerations na. When you talk about contract price, it pertains to the amount of consideration to which an entity expects to be entitled in exchange for transferring the goods or the service. Diba? So, magkano yung sisingilin. Excluding amounts collected on behalf of third parties, example will be yung sales taxes or any amount na winidhold mo that you're going to remit later on to another person or to another entity. Okay? As a practical expedient under PFRS 15, pag sinabing practical expedient, basically, to simplify, okay? To simplify, an entity may not discount a trade receivable if it is due within 1 year kasi nga insignificant yung ating present value computations if it is collectible within 1 year. Okay? So, ganun lang naman yan. However, that is just the practical expedient. Okay? Kung ibig sabihin yan, kung may ma-encounter kang problem na nagbigay pa rin ng present value factor kahit collectible within 1 year na yung item, then you still subject that to present value. Kasi, ibig sabihin, ang intention ng problem is for you to use the actual concept of PFRS 15 without using the practical expedient approach or the practical expedient provision. Okay, so yun lang naman yan. So with regards to recognition of your receivables, particularly your trade receivable, you are of course going to recognize it when you as the entity already has the right to the consideration that is unconditional. Ibig sabihin, nabigay mo na yung goods or services doon sa other party, which is the customer, and you are not retaining any control over that particular goods or services. So, ibig sabihin, fully, on your part, fully na na-recognize na natin yung item. Diba? So, ganun yung concept na if you can still remember the concepts that we discussed in the framework, okay, or in our previous topic. So, in that case, dahil wala naman ng naiiwan or wala naman ng retain control, okay? So, fully recognized na. So, ibig sabihin, fully recognize na rin natin yung receivable kasi wala naman ng condition involved or condition na attached doon sa ating receivable. Also, similar to what you learned in basic accounting, you need to always go back to the concepts of your shipping terms, okay? Or the interpretation of your various shipping points or shipping terms. Generally, we have FOB shipping point at saka FOB destination. Yan lang naman yung dalawang usual, no? Kapag sinabi nating FOB shipping point, tapos point of view ito na tayo yung nagbenta, di ba? So, in that case, FOB shipping point, tayo yung nagbenta. Upon giving the goods to the courier or yung shipper natin, na-transfer na yung ownership. So, ibig sabihin, we can now recognize the sale on that point. However, under FOB destination, the transfer of ownership will only happen when the buyer already receives the goods. So, ibig sabihin in that case, hindi ka pa pwedeng mag-recognize ng sales at hindi ka pa pwedeng mag-recognize din ng receivable unless the buyer already receives the goods. Okay? So, yan yan. For subsequent measurement of your receivables, you are going to measure it at amortized cost using the effective interest method. Okay? However, for your accounts receivable, we also consider other measurements or estimations of your net realizable value, which is in this case through the measurement of your allowance for bad debts and other allowances. Okay? So, kasama yun sa measurement natin particularly for accounts receivable. So, talking about that, ito na yung subsequent measurement ng AR or ng receivables natin. So, that's basically going to be NRV or net realizable value, which is getting the original cost or the historical cost of the receivable less any allowance that you establish for that receivable. Certain allowances are as follows. First will be allowance for freight charge. Bakit kailangan mong maglagay ng allowance for freight charge? Kasi 'di ba? Ito yung pertaining to certain amounts na ibabawas natin sa receivable in relation doon sa mga freight charges na binayaran ng buyer na supposedly tayo ang magbabayad. Diba? So, ito yung example nito is kapag FOB shipping point pero freight ang ginawa natin is kapag FOB destination pero ang freight is collect. Diba? In that case kasi kapag FOB destination, so tayo pa rin dapat yung magbabayad kasi tayo pa yung may-ari upon shipment. Kaso freight collect, so nagbayad niyan is si buyer. So kailangan natin i-reduce yung shipment cost doon sa receivables kasi i-net na rin yan nung ating buyer later on kapag magbabayad ng receivable. Kasi sabi niya, o magbabayad sana akong receivable at this amount, pero ako naman nagbayad ng shipment na dapat kayo yung magbayad. So, inenet na lang natin. Kaya merong allowance for freight charge. Allowance for sales returns pertains to the amount that you are going to deduct, no, to your receivables. Kasi may mga binenta ka na meron pang um, possible returns, okay, na matatanggap. So this is done whenever you have a certain reliable estimate on the amount of returns that you are going to get. Okay, so in that case, lagay ka ng allowance for sales returns kasi ano ang magiging issue natin kapag hindi tayo naglagay ng allowance? 'Di ba? Take note, kung kailan dapat nangyari yung sale, doon din dapat nag-recognize ng sales return. Okay? So, pag hindi ka gumawa ng allowance, paano kapag may returns kang natanggap during the subsequent period na pertaining to the previous period pala? Kapag doon ka sa subsequent period naglagay ng sales return, edi overstated na yung sales return mo. Supposedly, it was charged nung previous period pa kasi pertaining to the previous period sales yun. Okay, matching principle, dapat kung kailan yung sale, di ba? Or kung kailan yung recognition ng revenues, doon din natin i-recognize lahat ng expenses. Okay? So, ganun yung concept niya. Kaya, instead na hintayin mong mag-return saka ka mag-recognize ng sales return, gawa ka na ng allowance in order for you to recognize fully the total amount of the expected sales returns. Anyway, wala namang issue yan kasi kapag yung, kunyari, na-collecta mo na lahat ng receivables tapos wala naman nang nag-return, pwede mong i-reverse yung allowance for sales returns. Ganun lang naman. Reversal lang no mga allowances. Okay? We also have allowance for sales discounts, similar nature sa sales returns, di ba? Kasi may mga binenta ka na hindi mo sure kung mag-a-avail ba sila ng discount or hindi. Okay? Yung allowance for sales discount na yan, ginagamit mo kapag ni-recognize mo under gross method yung ating sales. Di ba? Kasi may tinatawag tayong gross method at saka net method of recognizing sales. So just to clarify, yung allowance for sales returns and allowance for sales discount, ginagamit lang natin yan kapag naka-gross method yung sales natin. Kung naka-net yung sales natin, wala nang allowances kasi automatic, ni-net na natin siya. Okay? And finally, allowance for doubtful accounts naman, yan yung pertaining to the amount that is uncertain as to collection. Okay? So, yan yung mga items natin. Pag nandun na tayo sa mga problems, doon na lang natin siya i-emphasize later on. So, talking about your sales discounts, dito na tayo mag-focus sa trade discounts and cash discounts. Of course, you already know this. Kapag sinabi nating trade discount, this is an amount that is deducted from the total list price for you to get the invoice price. So, ibig sabihin, yung trade discount, walang journal entry yan. Kasi ang pinapasok lang naman talaga natin as sales is the invoice amount. So, that although the trade discount is relevant kasi pag hindi mo yan binawas sa list price, overstated yung sales mo. Okay, so, it is considered to compute the invoice price pero walang journal entry ang trade discount. Okay? For cash discount naman, kasi yan, di ba yan yung volume discount or pwede rin siyang tawagin na prompt payment discount, yan na yung may journal entry. Depende kung ikaw ay gumagamit ng net method or gross method of recognizing your receivables or your sales, iba yung journal entries natin dyan. Okay? We also need to consider yung traditional measurement ng sales discount at saka yung PFRS treatment, which is yung pagpo-provide ng contract liability in relation to your discount. Okay? We are going to provide a specific example of that. Pero just remember, yung traditional GAAP na sinasabi natin, yan yung inaral mo sa basic accounting na kapag merong sales discount, recognize mo agad, parang ganun. Or you're only going to recognize the sales discount kung meron na mismong nagbayad on time. Pero yung concept kasi ng FRS 15, yung may contract liability, at the inception of the sale pa lang, mag-recognize ka na ng contract liability pertaining to the discount that is possible. So, Kasi parang ano din siya, parang yung tinatawag nating gross method, net method, pero hindi mo kasi pwedeng sabihin na PFRS 15 is net method because gross method and net method both pertains to traditional GAAP. Pag sinabi natin PFRS 15 or IFRS 15 provision, that is the contract liability concept. Okay? We will have a separate specification or separate example for us to illustrate yung contract liability na yan. Yun. Okay? From there, we will also discuss yung iba't ibang method ng pag-recognize ng doubtful accounts. Okay? So, yun actually ang nagpapa-complicate kung bakit dumadami yung laman ng ating trade or ng ating accounts receivable is because of the various methods used. Okay? Actually, that's also the reason why they established PFRS 15 para mas mabilis na lang yung or para mas simplified na lang yung recognition natin at saka accounting natin for revenues with customers. Okay? So, yung methods ng pag-record ng doubtful accounts, you have the direct write-off method pero that is not acceptable under financial accounting and reporting. Although siya yung mas tinatanggap kapag taxation. Kaya nga case-to-case basis, since we are in financial accounting and reporting, we are not generally going to accept direct write-off. So, also in auditing, ang nangyari dyan is, ang binigay is direct write-off, i-reverse mo at gagawin mong allowance method. Kasi ang allowed sa atin is allowance method under financial accounting and reporting. So, under the allowance method, we are allowed to use either the percentage of sales, percentage of receivables, and aging of receivables. Okay, when we talk about percentage of sales, of course, we're only talking about percentage of credit sales. Kasi bakit ka mag-recognize ng doubtful accounts kung cash naman yung sales, di ba? When you talk about percentage of receivables, simple lang yan. Kunin mo yung percentage ng receivables pagkatapos or kunin mo yung total balance ng receivable, multiply mo ng certain percentage. Okay? Aging of receivables is more complicated because what you're going to do there is to group first your receivables based on their age or kung overdue na sila or hindi pa, at kung overdue na, how many days overdue, so that you can determine what percentage of these receivables are still collectible, okay, and the percentage that is uncollectible, tapos yun yung gagamitin mong amount. Okay? Take note, the classification of the doubtful accounts expense can be either distribution cost or administrative cost depending on who approves or grants the credit. So this is for purposes lang of later on kapag nandun ka na sa presentation ng iyong income statement or ng iyong profit or loss at ikaw ay gumagamit ng function of expense method. Kasi sa function of expense method, meron ka kasing selling expense tapos administrative expense. Okay? So, kailan ang general rule kasi yan or ang general classification ng bad debts or doubtful accounts is of course administrative. Kasi malamang ang nag-grant dapat ng credit is or yung nag-authorize ng credit is a department that is independent from the sales department. Okay? Pwedeng ang nag-approve niyan is si accounting or ang nag-approve niyan is si kung sino man yung may hawak ng ledger ng mga customers para malaman kung pwede pang pautangin or hindi na. However, there are situations na ang nag-grant ng credit is also the sales department. So in that case, sales na kayong nagbebenta, sales pa yung nag-grant ng credit. So the doubtful accounts will now be treated as distribution cost. Kasi ang nag-a-approve si sales department. Okay? So ganun lang naman yan. Okay. Again, pagdating natin dun sa allowance method of accounting for bad debts, of course, we need to always remember yung journal entries. Okay? Kung like for example, kapag ikaw ay nagkaroon ng normal na allowance, di ba? Pag normal na allowance yun, that's going to be i-debit to the bad debts expense or the doubtful accounts expense and credit to allowance. Kapag nagkaroon ng write-off, That's going to be a debit to the allowance and a credit immediately to your receivables. Tapos kapag nagkaroon ng recovery, i-reverse mo lang ulit, debit mo ulit yung receivable, ibabalik mo yung allowance sa credit side, tapos kolektahin mo na, debit to cash, credit dun sa receivable na ni-recover mo. Okay? This will also involve, of course, the analysis of your T accounts ng iyong receivables at saka T accounts ng iyong doubtful accounts. Yan. So, this is particularly relating to your constructive accounting. So, in the analysis of your receivables, aside from analyzing the journal entries, it is also possible for you to simply analyze the T accounts because interrelated naman yung balances ng allowance for doubtful accounts at saka ng ating accounts receivable. So, yun lang naman. Okay. So, as emphasized a while ago, yung ating estimation of doubtful accounts can be net credit sales method or percentage of sales, percentage of ending receivable method din at saka yung aging. So, hindi pa rin naman nagbabago yan. Karamihan ganyan pa rin. Okay? The only thing here that you need to check is, particularly kapag nasa aging method ka, i-check mo talaga specifically yung age ng mga receivables. Kasi meron yung tinatawag, just to give an example, no? Kunyari, ang credit term natin is 2/10 net 30. So, ibig sabihin, 30 days, tapos, yun yung due date niya. So, kunyari, lumabas, age of the receivable, nakalagay 0 to 30 days. So, ibig sabihin, yung mga 0 to 30 days, hindi pa siya overdue, di ba? So, ibig sabihin, wala pa talaga siyang doubtful as to collection. That's why you need to consider. Iba kasi yung 0 to 30 days, iba rin yung 0 to 30 days overdue. Sorry, or 1 to 30 days overdue. Okay? Kasi iba yung actual days, iba din yung days overdue. Magkaiba kasi yun. Pag sinabi natin, so balikan natin yung example. Kung ang credit term natin is 2/10 and 30, kapag sinabi ng 1 to 30 days overdue, ibig sabihin, ang age niya is between 31 days to 60 days. Yun na siya, di ba? So, parang ganun yung kailangan mo lang i-analyze. Kasi minsan na pagbabaliktad ng estudyante yan, akala nila yung 0 to 30 days pertains to the overdue immediately. So, you need to recheck those items. Yan. Also, this is the last concern natin sa ating trade and other receivables, yung customer's credit balance. So, of course, kapag nagkaroon ng credit balance yung customer, di ba, ang receivables dapat debit. So, the only reason, malamang, kung bakit nagkaroon ng credit balance yung customer is because of overpayment. So, meaning, nagkaroon ng advance payment yung ating customer sa atin. So, what are we supposed to do? Okay? So, the credit balance on a client's account should not form part of receivables, but rather part of current liabilities kasi may advance payment siya. Sumabra yung bayad, dapat isasauli natin yon or ipangbabawas na lang natin dun sa utang na later kapag umorder siya. Or meron na naman siyang kinuhang goods from the entity or from sa atin. So, supposedly, yan ay current liabilities. Kasi, particularly sa mga audit concerns natin, may mga ganyang situation. Syempre, kapag yung credit balance ng customer ay naisama sa receivables, understated na yung ating receivable. So, we need to classify it correctly. So, that's basically for your trade and non-trade receivables. So, with that, we are going to proceed already with your notes receivable naman. So, the next concern with regards to your loans and receivables will be notes receivable. Okay, so practically the main difference lang naman, no, between your accounts receivable per se, kasi pag sinabi naman nating trade receivables, usually it pertains to your accounts receivable. So with regards to notes receivable, ang notes receivable naman is utang ng customer evidenced by a promissory note. Generally, since there is a promissory note, there will now become there will now be an interest, okay, relating to your receivable. So, magbabayad na siya ng interest. Okay? Yun nga lang, Pagdating natin sa notes receivable, pwedeng dapat may interest pero ang ginawa ng company non-interest bearing. Pwede ring interest bearing siya, kaso ang ginawa ng company, either sinobrahan niya yung interest or binawasan niya yung interest in relation to the market rate. So what will be, or those are generally our concerns pagdating dun sa notes receivable na yan. Okay? So unahin muna natin yung definition. So by definition, a note receivable is a claim supported by a formal promise to pay. Okay? So yun nga, may promissory note. Tapos, there will be a future payment, of course, and the future payment is established doon sa terms ng promissory note din natin. So for the initial measurement, of course, we're going to recognize yung value ng receivable based on the fair value, okay, plus the transaction costs that are directly attributable to the acquisition, okay, except for trade receivables. Okay, so kasi kapag trade receivables, ano ulit yung ginagamit? Iba, transaction price na siya. Okay? Pero all other receivables is going to be fair value plus transaction cost. Okay? So, yun ang ating consideration dyan. So, again, to reiterate, no? Kapag trade receivable, transaction price, you follow the provision of PFRS 15. Pero kapag non-trade yan, yung normal, kasi parang magiging part na yan ng normal na financial instrument natin or financial assets natin. In that case, ang measurement ng financial asset kasi is fair value plus transaction cost. So, yun yung magiging measurement niya. So, yun yung dahilan kung bakit iba ang measurement sa trade notes receivable at saka yung non-trade na notes receivable. Okay? So, to reiterate, kapag trade receivable, PFRS 15 ang ginagamit natin. Kapag non-trade, gagamitin natin siya ng PFRS 9. Okay? Or since hindi pa naman superseded talaga fully yung PAS 39, ganun din lang. Financial instrument kasi siya, particularly financial asset. So in that case, kapag financial asset, fair value plus transaction. We will discuss that further kapag nandun na tayo sa discussion ng investments. Okay. So, ito yung measurements natin. Okay? So, kapag yung receivable ay short-term, tapos, meron tayong separate column for initial measurement and subsequent measurement. So, the initial measurement of short-term receivable will be face amount, okay, or present value. Pwede ring transaction price for trade receivables. Okay? Again, di ba, bakit may present value pa rin dito? Kasi, possible nga na i-measure natin at present value kahit short-term yan, not unless in-impose nung company or in-impose nung nangongolect ng company yung practical expedient wherein i-recognize na lang siya at face amount without discounting. Okay, subsequent measurement will be recoverable historical cost or amortized cost or PFRS 15. Depende kung ano ang applicable na standard doon sa short-term na receivable. Okay? Kasi 'di ba, yun nga, kapag trade receivable siya, gagamitin mo syempre yung PFRS 15. All others, okay, all other receivables, gamitin mo yung recoverable historical cost or amortized cost. Yun lang. Kapag long-term naman, syempre measure mo siya at face amount. Okay, tapos recoverable historical cost. Ang assumption dito is since long-term siya, interest-bearing siya, so face amount siya, separate yung recognition ng interest. Ngayon, kapag long-term pero zero interest, ibig sabihin hindi ka naningil ng interest, ibig sabihin yan, nakatago or imputed yung interest natin dyan. So in that case, since the interest rate is imputed, we need to look for it and compute for the present value of the receivable. And from your amortization, you're going to measure the amortized cost, okay, together with the amount of interest applicable for the periods relating to the long-term receivable. Kapag long-term with unreasonable interest naman, ganun din, ipe-present value mo siya. Pero ang gagawin mo is, you're going to amortize it also. Ang difference lang nito ngayon is, meron kang effective interest, meron kang nominal interest. Ang nominal interest is based on the unreasonable interest dyan. Tapos yung market interest rate natin is kung ano yung dapat talaga na interest rate na pinatong or na inimpose doon sa utang. Yun. So, ganun lang naman yung items natin dyan. So, again, meron tayong specific na computations later on. So, please take note that the fair value of the receivable at initial recognition may be measured in relation to the cash price equivalent. Okay? Ano yung concept ng cash price equivalent? Ang concept niyan is, iba kasi yung usapan kapag kokolektahin mo siya outright cash at kokolektahin mo siya in terms of receivable muna tapos subsequent collection later on. Okay? So, kapag meron kasing cash price equivalent at iba yung cash price equivalent, usually mas mababa yan doon sa total receivable na kinokolekta mo, it simply means that the difference, okay, between the receivable and the cash price equivalent is already interest. So, in that case, kailangan mong alamin yung effective interest kasi i-amortize mo yung difference. Hindi pwede kasi na i-recognize mo yung, kunyari, kung sale man yan or kung yan man ay sale na in relation to ang natanggap mo muna from the customer is a promissory note tapos saka babayaran. So, the difference between the cash price equivalent, which is the price kung babayaran sana ng customer ngayon, okay, at saka yung laman ng notes receivable, okay, will now be charged as interest. So, you need to amortize that difference, okay, using the effective interest method later on. Okay? So, yun siya. In such case, the subsequent measurement of the receivable is at amortized cost. Of course, amortized cost using effective interest method. Okay? Pag nandun na tayo sa mga example, we will give you an idea or we will discuss ano ba ang importance ng straight line method ng pag-amortize in relation to effective interest method ng pag-amortize. Okay? So, we will discuss that later on. Yan. Also, important computations natin pagdating sa notes receivable is yung knowledge natin sa pagko-compute ng various present value factors. Okay? Because your present value factors will now be different or computed based on the nature at saka timing nung generally amount at saka yung timing nung ating cash flows. Okay? So, kapag minsanan yung bayad, lump sum yun. So, gagamitin mong present value factor, lump sum din. Okay? Kapag ang pagbabayad ay terms, okay, or one period after the transaction, then that is known as ordinary annuity. So, the present value should be ordinary annuity also. Kailan nangyari yung annuity due? Ang annuity due is series of payments, pero yung first payment is on the transaction date itself. So, kumbaga may unang pabayad ka na. So, now, the present value that you need to compute is present value annuity due. And finally, we have present value of deferred annuity. Ito yung situation wherein annuity siya, okay, series of payment, pero hindi siya agad magsa-start doon sa first period immediately from the transaction date. Usually, pwedeng maghihintay muna ng 2 years tapos yung first payment will be after 2 years. So, pag ganun, deferred annuity na yan. So, paano mo i-compute ulit yon? So, again, we will have a separate example for that. Okay? Pero yon, generally, since you already encountered this in your intermediate accounting, in your lower years, dapat alam nyo na rin yung pagko-compute yan using your calculator, of course. And since we are talking about calculators, diba, make sure that the calculator that you're using is authorized doon or nakasama siya doon sa listahan ng authorized calculator by the PRC, okay, or by the BOA. But anyway, parehas lang naman kasi ina-adapt lang naman ng BOA yung accepted or basically either magbibigay ng suggested list din si BOA. So yun, kaya kailangan i-check mo. And of course, take note, there are certain calculators na pwede for other board examinations pero hindi pwede sa board examination or licensure examination for accountants. So make sure na alam mo yung or check mo yung tamang listahan. So yun yung pagdating sa ating notes receivable.